There exists a place where time has stopped, where the boundary between human memory and nature's dominion has dissolved into something neither dead nor alive. 40 miles from Shanghai's gleaming towers, on the remote island of Shengshan, stands what locals call Wuringkan, the no-person village. Houtouwan. The name translates simply to Back Bay, but there is nothing simple about what has happened here. This is not a village that burned. It did not flood. No plague swept through its narrow streets. No war reduced it to rubble. The people of Houtouwan simply left, and in their absence, something else arrived. From the mist-shrouded cliffs of Shengshan Island, you can see it, a cascade of green pouring down steep mountainsides toward the East China Sea. Buildings emerge like ghosts from beneath a suffocating blanket of vegetation. Ivy crawls through windows where children once looked out at fishing boats. Vines strangle doorways where families once gathered for meals. Trees grow from rooftops where laundry once dried in the salt air. This is Houtouwan, one of the most verdant, haunting, and mysterious abandoned places on Earth. A fishing village of over 3,000 souls, swallowed whole by nature in less than 20 years. But the question that draws tourists, photographers, and the curious from around the world is not simply how this happened. It is why. Why would an entire community vanish? What drove them from their homes so completely that furniture still sits in abandoned rooms, as if waiting for owners who will never return? And perhaps most unsettling, what stories linger in the silence between the vines? The story begins in the 1950s, in the years following the Chinese Revolution of 1949. Houtouwan was born from necessity and opportunity. The People's Republic was young, and national initiatives to strengthen coastal fisheries brought new life to remote islands like Shengshan. The village was established as a fishing outpost in this chain of nearly 400 islands known as the Shengshan Archipelago, the only archipelago in China officially designated as a national scenic area. The location was both a blessing and a curse. Houtouwan clung to the northern cliffs of Shengshan, nestled in a low-lying area between two headlands, surrounded by mountains on 3 sides and facing the choppy waters of the East China Sea on the 4th. The terrain was steep, almost hostile to development. But the seas were rich. In those early years, the village was modest. Simple wooden structures housed the first fishing families. The settlers were hardy people, drawn by the promise of the East China Sea's abundant marine resources. They caught fish, dried their harvests on rooftops under the sun and salt air, and slowly built a community from stone and sweat. By the 1960s and 1970s, prosperity arrived. The fishing boom transformed Houtouwan from a humble outpost into a thriving village. Wooden homes gave way to concrete buildings, some 2 or 3 stories high. The population swelled beyond 3,000 residents at its peak in the 1980s. The village earned a nickname among islanders, Little Taiwan, for its relative affluence and bustling streets. Life in Houtouwan followed the rhythms of the sea. Fishermen departed before dawn in small boats, their vessels rising and falling with the swells. Lin Fazan, one of the few who remained behind, recalls those days with the clarity of someone who lived them fully. In 1984, he ran a small store near the harbor. He sold cigarettes, alcohol, fishing supplies, canned food, biscuits, and fruit imported by boat from the mainland. They went to the sea when the boats were sailing, and they came back when it got windy. Lin remembered years later. They played mahjong. When the seas were too rough, the fishermen stayed ashore. They gathered in cramped rooms, smoking, gambling, passing time until the winds calmed. The community was tight-knit out of necessity. Isolation forges bonds that cities never know. Children attended the local school. A small clinic served the sick and injured. Markets opened in the mornings, selling vegetables grown on terraced plots carved into the hillsides. Families built courtyards, planted gardens. The architecture spread up and over the steep inclines of adjacent coves, houses stacked upon houses, connected by winding stone pathways and stairs that climbed the mountains like veins. During the 1970s and 1980s, Houtouwan achieved its zenith. Post-cultural revolution reforms promoted rural commercialization. The fishing industry expanded. Houtouwan became a key node in the regional economy, exporting dried fish to mainland markets and beyond. The village had infrastructure that many rural communities lacked: a school, a clinic, markets, even a sense of permanence. For a time, it seemed that Houtouwan would endure forever. But islands are fragile places, and the sea, which gave everything, would eventually take it all away. The decline began quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the late 1980s. The first signs were economic. Larger fishing operations from nearby Shanghai began to dominate the industry. Industrial trawlers with modern equipment harvested fish faster and more efficiently than Houtouwan's small boats ever could. The bay that had sustained the village for decades could no longer compete. Fish stocks dwindled. The seas, once teeming with life, grew emptier each season. Some say rampant commercial fishing meant the town couldn't support itself. One visitor observed years later. It's an irony that haunts the story of Houtouwan. Prosperity from the sea, destroyed by prosperity from the sea. But it wasn't just the fish. The village's location, once an asset, became a liability. Houtouwan was remote, truly remote. Getting to the mainland required a grueling journey. A taxi ride across the bridge to neighboring Tuki Island, then a 3.5-hour ferry to Shengshan port, followed by a 2-hour drive to Shanghai. The trip could take 5 to 6 hours on a good day. When storms came, which they often did, the village was cut off entirely. Boats couldn't land in the rough seas, and the only connection to the rest of Shengshan was a steep, winding footpath over the mountains. Education became a problem. The village school was small, under-resourced. Parents wanted better opportunities for their children, opportunities that didn't exist on a remote island. Healthcare was limited. Food delivery was unreliable. Even basic amenities like electricity and running water were inconsistent. As China's economy modernized and cities expanded, the gap between urban life and Houtouwan's existence grew unbearable. Wang Yi left the village at age 5 when his family moved to the island's main town to access better services. Decades later, when he returned as a 27-year-old college graduate, he would gather honeysuckles from the abandoned gardens to make a fragrant tea that reminded him of his birthplace. But for his parents, leaving wasn't nostalgia, it was survival. By the 1990s, the exodus had begun in earnest. Families moved one by one, then in groups. They sought work on the mainland. They chased jobs, schools, hospitals, the infrastructure of modernity that Houtouwan could never provide. A former resident, now in her 40s, who returns occasionally to work as a safety officer for tourists, remembers it simply. It was a lot of fun when we were young, going down to the beach to collect seafood. But by the mid-1990s, once people had more money, they all moved out one after another up into the town. That's how it was. The departure was gradual, but relentless. By 1994, only a handful of people remained. The school closed. The clinic shut down. The markets emptied. Houses stood silent, their windows like hollow eyes staring at the sea. In 2002, Houtouwan was officially depopulated and merged into the nearby village of Minfu. But the story doesn't end with bureaucracy, because while the people left, something else remained. And in the silence of their absence, it began to grow. Nature does not wait. In the humid subtropical climate of Shengshan Island, where rainfall is frequent and temperatures remain mild year-round, vegetation grows with astonishing speed. Winters are not harsh enough to slow it. Summers are not dry enough to stop it. The air is thick with moisture from the sea. Mist rolls through the village like a living thing. And so, within months of abandonment, the first pioneers arrived. Mosses and lichens appeared first, colonizing the concrete surfaces, breaking down materials, creating substrate. Then came the herbaceous plants, small, tenacious, rooting in cracks. Shrubs followed, then vines. The climbing plants were particularly aggressive. Ivy, wisteria, and various species of creepers found the abandoned buildings irresistible. They scaled walls, wrapped around support beams, entered through broken windows. Their tendrils found purchase in every crevice, every gap between stones. As they grew, their roots wedged deeper, forcing structures apart with slow, inexorable pressure. The vegetation acted like a sponge, retaining moisture, accelerating the degradation of urban structures. Roofs began to sag under the weight of accumulated plant matter. Windows disappeared beneath curtains of leaves. Doors became impassable, choked with growth. This is ecological succession in action, the natural process through which ecosystems gradually regain balance after human disturbance. And Houtouwan's climate was perfect for it. Frequent rain, high humidity, stable temperatures, and proximity to the sea created ideal conditions for rapid, continuous growth. Trees sprouted, not just small saplings, but substantial trees, rising from courtyards, from rooftops, from places where their seeds had lain dormant until the human presence withdrew. A visitor in 2018 described the scene, blanketed with greenery. The ghost town is perched atop cliffs, looking west into sea mists obscuring the horizon. Abandoned homes ravaged by weather and creeping vines stand silent but for the surf, the whine of mosquitoes, and birdsong. The silence itself is part of the haunting. Gone are the voices of fishermen, the laughter of children, the sounds of daily life. What remains is a different kind of sound. Wind through leaves, birdsong, the distant crash of waves against the rocks below. From a distance, especially in summer, when vegetation is at its fullest, Houtouwan looks less like a village and more like a green hillside, punctuated by white fragments, the tips of buildings, jutting through the foliage like bones through skin. Only when you approach do the telltale right angles and hard shadows of architecture reveal themselves beneath the verdant shroud. At first, it appears that only a few houses still stand, little whitewashed fingertips jutting up from the greenery, one journalist wrote. But as you approach, the telltale right angles and hard shadows of architecture stand out from the vines. Gradually, the realization dawns that the gorge leading down to the choppy blue ocean is filled with man-made structures, reclaimed by creeping ivy. The transformation happened with shocking speed. Within a decade, entire buildings vanished beneath the green. Within 15 years, Houtouwan looked as though it had been abandoned for a century. Scientists would later study the phenomenon as an example of nature's resilience. The climbing plants stabilized soil, preventing erosion from the frequent rains and coastal winds. The vegetation created microclimates, supporting diverse plant communities that varied depending on exposure to sun, wind, and water. Birds returned. Insects thrived. The village became a functioning ecosystem. But the plants did not discriminate. They consumed homes, schools, temples, everything humans had built. The village that had stood for 50 years was being systematically erased, inch by inch, leaf by leaf. And inside those abandoned buildings, time stopped. Furniture remained exactly as it had been left. Beds still held their blankets. Kitchen utensils sat on counters. Children's toys lay scattered on floors, now covered in moss and vines. The appearance created an eerie impression that the residents had fled in sudden panic, leaving everything behind. But the truth was slower, sadder. They left gradually, over years. What remained was simply what wasn't worth carrying. The belongings of lives once lived. Memories wrapped in vines. It was inevitable that stories would grow in the silence. The Chinese call it gui kun, Ghost Village. The name emerged organically on social media, spreading through forums and posts, taking on a life of its own. Lin Fazin, the former store owner who now farms vegetables on abandoned plots, laughs at the notion. People got scared and said ghosts were living here, so it was called Ghost Village, he said, taking a drag from his cigarette. I've lived in this world for such a long time and have never met one, but not everyone shares his skepticism. Tourists and urban explorers who made the pilgrimage to Houtouwan speak of the atmosphere with an unmistakable unease. The combination of abandonment, overgrowth, and isolation creates a psychological weight. The mist that frequently blankets the village doesn't help. It rolls in from the sea, obscuring paths, making familiar landmarks disappear and reappear like phantoms. On Chinese social media platforms like Weibo, stories began to circulate. Tales of strange sounds echoing through the empty structures. Whispers in the wind that might be voices, or might be nothing at all. Tourists claimed to hear footsteps on the overgrown paths, only to turn and find no one there. Some bloggers reported an overwhelming sense of being watched as they explored deeper into the village. They described standing alone in abandoned homes, surrounded by the belongings of people long gone, feeling as though the owners might return at any moment. One travel writer described it this way: "You will feel like you are in a different world. The silence is broken only by the sound of birds, insects, and wind. The air is fresh and fragrant with the smell of plants. The houses and streets are hidden under layers of vegetation, creating a sense of mystery and curiosity. You will wonder what stories and secrets lie behind the walls and windows. The mystery is compounded by how the village was left. Unlike many abandoned places that show signs of looting or vandalism, Houtouwan remains remarkably intact. Personal items sit undisturbed. Clothing hangs in closets. Photographs remain on walls, faces staring out from behind cracked glass and clinging ivy. There are rumors, though unverified, of belongings that suggest sudden departure. Stories circulate on forums about a classroom in the abandoned school, with chairs still arranged, as though students had just stood up and walked out. Of temples with offerings left decades ago, now covered in moss, but still recognizable. Some urban legends speak of the school itself as a repository for something darker. Whispers on Chinese forums mention coffins stored in the building, though no credible sources confirm this. The rumor persists anyway, fed by the human need to explain the inexplicable feeling of wrongness that some visitors experience. Huang Dan, a 22-year-old student who visited in 2018, put it differently. It feels like this place belonged to nature from the very beginning, and the old invaders finally left, and nature finally made it back. Perhaps that's the true ghost of Houtouwan. Not spirits of the dead, but the spirit of nature itself, reclaiming what was always hers. Former residents who return speak of dreams. Wang Yi, who left at age 5, says that when he visits, memories surface that feel more like visions than recollections. The smell of the sea, the sound of his mother's voice calling him home, the taste of fish dried on rooftops. These sensory memories are so vivid, they seem to hang in the air itself, trapped like the village in time. Another phenomenon tourists report is the optical illusion created by the vegetation. From certain angles, especially in dim light or mist, the green-covered buildings seem to pulse, to breathe. It's a trick of perception, wind moving through leaves, but it's deeply unsettling. The village appears alive in a way that has nothing to do with the humans who once inhabited it. The most persistent legend concerns time itself. Multiple visitors have noted that spending hours in Houtouwan feels like stepping out of the normal flow of time. The isolation, the silence, the overwhelming presence of nature where humanity used to be, it creates a dissociative state. People emerge from the village disoriented, unable to recall exactly how long they've been walking the overgrown paths. One photographer who documented the village in 2015 said, "Using the drone to explore the village first, was a good idea as the paths were not well maintained and overgrown. Some of the buildings were in tatters, while others looked like they were going through a remodel. It was all very strange indeed. Because Houtouwan resists easy categorization, it is neither fully abandoned nor entirely reclaimed. It exists in a liminal space, a threshold between what was and what will be. And humans have always feared thresholds. They are places where rules change, where the familiar becomes alien. Whether or not ghosts walk the vine-covered streets of Houtouwan is unknowable, but something lingers there. Something that defies rational explanation and scientific study. Perhaps it's just the accumulated weight of memory, the psychic residue of 3,000 lives lived, loved, and lost in those buildings. Or perhaps it's something stranger. Either way, those who visit feel it, and those who feel it never quite forget. Not everyone left. In 2015, when the viral photographs first drew global attention to Houtouwan, reporters discovered that 5 people still lived among the ruins. Sun Ayu was one of them. At 59 years old, the former fisherman had made the conscious choice to stay behind when his neighbors departed. He lived alone in a house with no running water and no electricity. The room where he slept and cooked his meals was a testament to radical simplicity. A bed, a small stove, basic utensils, nothing more. He rarely left the village, venturing to the town across the hill only for an occasional game of mahjong. In photographs from 2015, Sun stands in his doorway, weathered face expressionless, surrounded by encroaching vegetation. Behind him, the interior of his home is dark, filled with shadows. When asked why he stayed, Sun gave no dramatic explanation. This was his home. These were his hills, his sea, his village. Where else would he go? Lin Fazen, the former shop owner, also remained. But unlike Sun, Lin adapted to the village's transformation. He turned the abandoned gardens and terraces into farmland, planting cauliflower, cabbage, lettuce, celery, and basil across more than 1,300 square meters scattered throughout Houtouwan. He moved through the green ruins like a gardener, tending an enormous, wild estate. When tourists began arriving, Lin became part of the attraction. His presence, living, working, surviving in a place most consider uninhabitable, added an element of human continuity to the ghost village narrative. He sold vegetables to the few visitors who stayed overnight on the island. He answered questions. He laughed at the ghost stories. A relaxed pack of dogs roamed with these last residents, moving freely through the abandoned homes, indifferent to the boundaries between human and natural spaces. They became fixtures in photographs, feral-looking animals standing between vine-covered houses, silent sentinels of a village that existed between worlds. These remaining residents offer testimony that complicates the ghost village narrative. Their presence proves that Houtouwan is not truly abandoned, not completely dead. It is something else, a place where a few have chosen to exist on nature's terms, accepting isolation and hardship in exchange for autonomy and connection to place. Su Yuding and his wife Tang Yaksu also returned daily, though they no longer lived in Houtouwan. They sold bottled water to tourists. There was nothing else to buy in the village. No cafes, no restaurants, no shops beyond what the last residents could offer. For these individuals, Houtouwan's story is not one of loss, but of transformation. They witnessed the village's decline and adaptation. They saw neighbors leave, buildings fall to ruin, nature advance. But they also saw something else, the emergence of a new kind of beauty, strange and melancholy. When asked about the legends, about the ghost stories and eerie atmosphere, their responses were pragmatic. Houses fall apart, plants grow, weather erodes stone. There's nothing supernatural about any of it. Yet even they acknowledge the weight of memory. Lin Fazen, farming his scattered plots among the ruins, sometimes works beside the home where a friend once lived. He tends vegetables and gardens where children once played. The ghosts of Houtouwan, if they exist, are not spirits but absences, the empty spaces where people used to be. A former resident who returns as a safety officer for tourists expressed a similar sentiment. In her 40s now, she remembers childhood in Houtouwan with fondness. It was a lot of fun when we were young, going down to the beach to collect seafood. But when asked if she would ever return to live permanently, her answer was immediate. No, the village is beautiful in its decay. It is peaceful in its abandonment, but it belongs to the past. The future lies elsewhere, and so the last residents occupy a strange position. They are caretakers of a place that no longer exists, guardians of memories that fade with each passing year. They maintain a connection to Houtouwan that most of their former neighbors severed decades ago. But time is not on their side. The remaining residents are aging. The buildings continue to deteriorate. Eventually, nature will complete its work, and even these last witnesses will depart. When that day comes, Houtouwan will truly become what it has long appeared to be: a village without people, a ghost town in truth as well as name. But for now, if you visit, you might still encounter Lin Fazan tending his vegetables among the vines, or Sun Ayu emerging from his darkened doorway to observe the tourists with quiet bemusement, or the dogs padding silently through the green ruins, guardians of a threshold between what was and what will be. They are the last living connections to Houtouwan's past. When they're gone, only stories will remain. In 2015, a photographer named Qing Jian visited Houtouwan. The images he captured and shared online changed everything. His photographs showed a village that looked impossible, almost fantastical. Buildings wrapped in lush greenery, as if someone had carefully draped every structure in a living blanket. Pathways disappearing into foliage. Windows obscured by walls of leaves. The contrast between rigid architectural forms and organic, chaotic plant growth created images that seemed to belong to a fairy tale or post-apocalyptic fiction rather than contemporary China. Within days, the photographs went viral on Chinese social media. Weibo exploded with shares, comments, reactions. International media picked up the story. National Geographic, CNN, The Guardian, Atlas Obscura. Outlets around the world published features on China's ghost village and the greenest village on Earth. The images tapped into something primal in the human imagination, the fantasy of nature reclaiming civilization, the beauty of decay, the poignant reminder of human impermanence. In an age of climate anxiety and environmental concern, Houtouwan became a symbol of what happens when humans withdraw, of nature's resilience, of the temporary nature of our supposedly permanent structures. But the sudden surge of interest created immediate problems. Chun Bio, an official on Shengshan Island, issued a statement in 2015 trying to temper expectations. Houtouwan of Shengshan hasn't been equipped with the conditions to open to tourists. We urge visitors to preserve its tranquility for now. The warning came too late. Tourists were already arriving. They made the long, arduous journey from Shanghai, 5 to 6 hours by bus and ferry, just to walk through the abandoned village and capture their own photographs. Some came unprepared, without proper shoes or supplies. The paths were muddy, overgrown, and dangerous. Buildings were structurally unsound, liable to collapse. There was no infrastructure to support visitors. No bathrooms, no food, no emergency services. Local authorities faced a dilemma. They couldn't stop people from coming, but they couldn't allow unrestricted access to a decaying village either. The solution took over 2 years to implement. In 2017, Houtouwan officially opened to tourism with controls. A viewing platform was constructed, offering an overview of the village from a safe distance. The entrance fee was modest, 20 yuan, about $3. For visitors who wanted to enter the village itself, a hiking fee of 50 yuan, approximately $8, granted access to a controlled circular walking loop. The paths were partially cleared and marked with warning signs. The signs were explicit: do not enter the deteriorating structures, do not disturb the vegetation, stay on marked paths. The buildings were unstable. The risk was real. Former residents found unexpected employment in the transformed village. They returned daily to work as guides and safety officers, keeping watch over tourists who might stray from safe areas or attempt to enter dangerous buildings. It was an ironic reversal. People who had abandoned Houtouwan for better opportunities now relied on its abandonment for income. The tourism revenue proved substantial. Photographers and videographers became particularly obsessed with Houtouwan. Joe Nafis, a Shanghai-based videographer, visited in 2021 to document the village with drone footage. His aerial perspectives revealed patterns invisible from the ground, how the buildings cascaded down the mountainside like a frozen waterfall of architecture, how the vegetation created gradients of green from bright new growth to darker established forests. Using the drone to explore the village first was a good idea, as the paths were not well maintained and overgrown. Nafis explained. Some of the buildings were in tatters, while others looked like they were going through a remodel. It was all very strange. The best time to visit, authorities and tour operators advised, was summer, when vegetation reached its fullest expression. But the village held different charms in different seasons. In spring, new growth emerged in brilliant greens. In autumn, some of the climbing plants turned gold and red. In winter, when temperatures dropped and rain came in sheets, the village appeared even more abandoned, more desolate. The mist, however, was constant. It rolled in from the sea throughout the year, transforming Houtouwan into something even more ethereal. In photographs taken during misty weather, the village appears to float between earth and sky, a place not quite real. Travel blogs and social media posts described the experience in near mystical terms. This place belonged to nature from the very beginning, and the old invaders finally left, and nature finally made it back, wrote one visitor. Another described it as a primordial tableau. Man versus nature, a ghost town on a distant island, a graveyard settlement that fills the mind with words like post-apocalypse and epic. But the commodification of abandonment raised uncomfortable questions. Was it ethical to turn human displacement into tourist entertainment? Were visitors honoring the memory of the village's former residents, or exploiting their loss for Instagram-worthy photographs? Did the controlled tourist experience dilute the authentic encounter with abandonment that the viral photographs promised? These debates played out in comment sections and travel forums with no clear resolution. What was undeniable, however, was that Houtouwan had achieved a strange kind of immortality. Through photography and tourism, the village became more famous in death than it ever was in life. The fishermen who once lived here could never have imagined that their abandoned homes would become internationally recognized symbols, that their departure would draw tens of thousands of visitors from around the world, that the village they left for better opportunities would become an opportunity itself, just not for them. Houtouwan was rediscovered, but what was found was not what was lost. It was something new, something stranger, a place transformed by absence into a monument to impermanence. On the surface, Houtouwan tells a simple story. Economic change drove rural depopulation, and nature reclaimed abandoned space. But the village's global resonance suggests it means something more. In the 21st century, as climate change and environmental collapse dominate headlines, Houtouwan offers an unexpected vision. Nature can recover, even thrive, when humans withdraw. The village stands as an accidental ecological success story. Within 2 decades, a functioning ecosystem replaced human habitation. Native plants returned. Birds nested in abandoned rafters. The soil stabilized. Water quality improved in the absence of human pollution. The vegetation that swallowed Houtouwan was not random. It followed patterns of ecological succession that scientists study worldwide. Pioneer species arrived first, creating conditions for more complex communities. Climbing plants like ivy and wisteria dominated because they could efficiently exploit vertical space. Trees established once enough soil had been created by decomposing plant matter. In this way, Houtouwan became a laboratory for observing accelerated ecosystem recovery. Environmental researchers interested in ecological restoration have studied the village as a model for understanding how quickly nature can reclaim disturbed land when left undisturbed. But the symbolic weight of Houtouwan extends beyond ecology. The village represents the dark side of China's rapid urbanization. Millions migrated from rural areas to cities in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, pursuing opportunities and modernity. Countless villages like Houtouwan emptied. Many simply decayed into forgettable ruins. Houtouwan's fate was unusual only in its visual drama, but it symbolized a nationwide transformation. This makes the village a site of cultural mourning. It represents lost ways of life, traditional communities, connections to land and sea that modernity severed. For older Chinese visitors especially, Houtouwan evokes nostalgia for a China that no longer exists, slower, smaller, rooted in place rather than chasing economic advancement. The village also challenges assumptions about permanence. We build structures to last. We invest buildings with meaning, homes as anchors of identity, temples as conduits to the sacred, schools as investments in the future. Houtouwan demonstrates how quickly such meanings dissolve when humans leave. Within years, homes become shelters for birds. Within decades, they become indistinguishable from the landscape. This impermanence unsettles us. We want to believe that what we build matters, endures, leaves a mark. Houtouwan suggests otherwise. It whispers that nature doesn't care about our monuments, that our absence barely registers as a pause before life continues in different forms. The philosopher would call this a meditation on mortality. The village becomes a metaphor for human life itself. We build, we inhabit, we leave, and something else takes our place. The vines that cover Houtouwan's buildings mirror the processes that will eventually cover all our works. Yet there is beauty in this dissolution. The photographs that made Houtouwan famous capture an aesthetic that resonates deeply. Decay transformed into art, loss reimagined as renewal, endings that are also beginnings. The village is most beautiful in its abandonment, most compelling in its silence. This creates a paradox. Houtouwan matters because people left. It became significant through absence. Its value lies in being useless, no longer productive, no longer inhabited, no longer fulfilling any economic function. In a world obsessed with utility and growth, Houtouwan represents the opposite. Decline as spectacle, abandonment as art. The village also raises questions about memory and forgetting. The tourists who visit know almost nothing about the people who lived here. They take photographs of empty buildings without knowing whose homes they were. They walk paths without understanding the lives once lived upon them. The village has become a stage for contemporary fantasies about nature and abandonment, while the actual human history fades into obscurity. Wang Yi, gathering honeysuckles for tea that reminds him of childhood, is a rare exception, someone maintaining a living connection to Houtouwan's past. But even he cannot fully bridge the gap. The village he remembers exists only in memory. What stands now is something else entirely. This is the final, perhaps deepest symbolism of Houtouwan. It demonstrates how quickly history becomes legend, becomes myth. The village exists at the boundary between memory and imagination, fact and fantasy. The stories told about it, both the verified accounts and the unconfirmed rumors, merge into a narrative that serves present needs rather than honoring past realities. In this way, Houtouwan becomes whatever we need it to be: a warning about climate change, a celebration of nature's resilience, a meditation on impermanence, a backdrop for photographs, a ghost story, a tourist attraction. All of these meanings are true. None of them captures the full reality of what Houtouwan was and is. Perhaps that's the village's final lesson, that places, like people, resist easy interpretation. They contain multitudes. They mean different things at different times to different observers. And when we try to pin down their significance, to make them stand for one idea or concept, we inevitably fail. Houtouwan is a village. It is an ecosystem. It is a memorial. It is a tourist site. It is a myth. It is all these things and none of them. What it definitely is, however, is a threshold, a boundary, a place where the human and the wild intersect, where past and present blur, where meaning and mystery become indistinguishable. And perhaps that's enough. Stand at the viewing platform above Houtouwan on a misty morning. Look down at the green cascade of vegetation pouring between abandoned buildings toward the sea. Listen to the silence, broken only by wind and birds and the distant crash of waves. Ask yourself, what is this place, really? The rational answer is straightforward. Houtouwan is an abandoned fishing village undergoing ecological succession. It was depopulated for understandable economic and logistical reasons. The vegetation that covers it grew through natural processes explained by well-established ecological principles. There is nothing mysterious about it.